Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here and our very special guest. Amitav Ghosh is a celebrated writer of novels, nonfiction essays and books, and even, I believe, one work of verse. His work has garnered a worldwide readership, numerous prizes, also around the world, including India's Padma Shri. It's one mark of the wide range of his writing that this is his second talk at the Macau Literary Festival this year. Yesterday, I and many of you were lucky enough to hear him speak about the climate crisis and environmental degradation more generally. He insisted that it was not just about climate, but really a wide range of issues. And today the focus will be instead on his historical writing, and that includes both historical fiction and historical nonfiction, and in particular, this suite of works on the Opium Wars, the trilogy, the Ibis trilogy, and the more recent book you see at the end there, Smoke and Ashes. But I've confirmed with Amitav that actually we would like this to be a wide-ranging discussion, treating any and all of his works, especially in the Q&A. So I encourage you to ask anything on your minds. And I expect that we'll see many connections between contemporary and historical topics in his comments today, as we already started to yesterday. And you're certainly, again, welcome to ask about those further in the Q&A. So before we get to Smoke and Ashes and the earlier Ibis trilogy, please join me in welcoming Dr. Amitav Ghosh. And also before we get to these works, I think I will start with a bit of personal history and ask you about your own upbringing. I gather that you had a peripatetic childhood. You were born in Calcutta, I believe. At the time it was Calcutta, now Kolkata, but also lived elsewhere around South Asia. And I'm very curious about how this informed your work. That's sort of the big question here, how these peripatetic origins informed your work. Did they also inform where you think of as home, and did they inform how you think of yourself?
Oh yes, very much so. So my childhood was spent in Dhaka, in Calcutta, and in Colombo. And I think the way that this kind of upbringing really influenced these books is that, I grew up speaking a kind of creolized English, of a kind that we used to speak in Sri Lanka, especially back in those days. It was very, very rich in obscenities, and so every second word was bugger, I was really sort of remembering, my childhood sort of speech patterns, and that was really fun because I think, these books are about a very, very grim subject, grim, awful. I mean, really one of the most horrible episodes in human history, I would say. So that kept me going, playing with the language, playing with the dialects, because the first and most important thing about the Indian Ocean, of course, is that it's very multilingual, and that really sort of feeds into my interests. Because I love languages, I love learning languages, I love listening to languages. So that was very exciting. But the thing is, when you're writing a novel can't be in many languages. Obviously it can't. I mean, the Indian Ocean was an incredibly multilingual space, and you can't hope to sort of, as it were, in any kind of naturalistic way, represent that variety. So what I chose to do instead was to use dialects of English, to suggest, the variety of languages. And fortunately, there are many dialects of English. There's that sort of Babu English that, I grew up speaking. Then there's the sort of English that Englishmen spoke in India, which was also very heavily influenced by Hindustani. We don't actually know how they spoke, But we do know from the letters that they wrote and even from their diaries and so on, that by the time they left India, after spending 30 years or whatever there, when they went back to Britain as nabobs, nobody could understand them. So obviously there was a huge impact linguistic impact on the ways that they spoke. They actually retained English, at least, in vocabulary and in grammar and so on. But the Dutch in Java, within one generation, Dutch would become their second language. This didn't really quite happen, though it did for some. I mean, Rudyard Kipling, for example, grew up speaking basically Hindustani and learned English much as I did when he was, I think, 6 years old or something. So this is a very important aspect of that experience, and I really enjoyed, playing with those linguistic things.
Can I ask where you feel at home? Is it Calcutta in some part of yourself, or do you feel that you're now a creature of your travels?
Well, I have a home in Calcutta, and when I'm there, I feel completely at home. But really, home for me now is Brooklyn.
Home for many people from around the world, Brooklyn.
Yes.
As we learned in the discussion just before this. So after this childhood moving around between India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and I believe Delhi was in there in the mix for university education, you studied in Oxford, and I'm curious about that experience, leaving South Asia, studying anthropology, I believe, and so that's part of the question, but more broadly, what connections did you find between this interest in languages, in literature, in anthropology now, which involves, as anybody who studied it knows, a lot of field work typically, among communities, outside of the classroom, and finally in history. How did these connections start to form in your intellectual makeup and in your interests?
Well, this is going to be a very long answer. So yes, I've always had actually I began my writing career as a journalist at an Indian, back in India in those days, there was no publishing scene. There was no sense that you could make a living as a writer. There was no literary career as such. So I started doing journalism, and actually, that's been a huge influence on my life. I mean, all through my life, I've continued to, do journalism and write for newspapers and magazines and so on, do reportage. And often that's what's kept me going, in a financial sense, as it were. So journalism has been a very important part of my life. But then I ended up in university studying anthropology because, anthropology and journalism have a lot of things in common. I mean, basically, you're just taking notes all the time, trying to listen to people, figure out, how their lives work. So I was very fortunate to get this scholarship to Oxford, and back in those days, if you were doing anthropology in any Western university, if you were not white, if you were brown or black or whatever, the expectation is that you would go back to your own country and study it, And I thought to myself, the last thing India needs is more anthropologists studying India. So I decided, it so happened that one day I was in a library and I found this wonderful book of letters. The book is actually called Letters of Medieval Jewish Traders. And I somehow found this letter in that collection, written in the 12th century by a Jewish trader who had gone to India and lived there 17 years and then returned to Egypt, which was where this community was based. And he had taken a slave with him, an Indian slave. And somehow, that story stuck in my head. So when they asked me what I wanted to study, where I wanted to do my fieldwork, I said, I'll do it in Egypt. And then I had this extraordinary experience that, anyone who's done anthropology will be familiar with. You're suddenly parachuted into a village where you don't know the language, you don't know anything. And everyone thinks you're an idiot because, in fact, you are an idiot, and suddenly I found myself having to learn Arabic, Of course, I'd done courses in Arabic and so on, so it wasn't entirely like that. But in fact, when Arabic being a diglossic language, when you end up in a situation like that, you learn the Arabic formally, and then suddenly you arrive in a village and you can't make a head or tail of what people are saying. But it's a great challenge, and it's sort of exciting. So I spent, a year living there, and it was a very formative experience in the sense that, it was traumatic at one level. I mean, it is really a trauma. I mean, if I had known those words back in those days, I would have said it was like PTSD, when you come out of it. Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary, They had never seen an Indian, and especially not a non-Muslim Indian, So every time they saw me, they would say, "Oh, do you feel like worshipping a cow today?" and in fact, it happened all the time. If I went for a walk and they saw someone, beating their ox or something, they would run and stop the guy and say, "Look, don't hurt his feelings," So it was amazing. I mean, just explaining the concept of cremation. That was one thing they knew about India, that Indians cremate their dead. And they simply could not get their heads around it. So they would say, "Oh, you mean you just burn them like a fish?" It was just constant stuff like that. Anyway, so, cumulatively this really adds up. And it does become kind of traumatic. But, what I really wanted to do was write novels. And that's been my aim since I was a teenager. What I really also wanted to do was to travel, because the writers that I was reading way back then, like James Baldwin, V.S. Naipaul, they were all great travelers, Bruce Chatwin and so on. And, the reason I really wanted to be, it was in that Egyptian village that I read 100 Years of Solitude, which had a really profound impact on me at that time. I'm sorry you hate magical realism. Anyway, so there I was. I went back. To Oxford, and one way or the other, I suddenly found myself, because my grant was running out, I found myself in a situation of having to write my entire DPhil thesis in 6 weeks. That's 80,000 words in 6 weeks. And when this news was broken to me by my supervisor that your grant is going to run out, if you don't finish in 6 weeks, you're out of here. So I just locked myself into a room and wrote, and I managed to finish. And that was really, I must say, a kind of crucible. But before that, being in this village, I never went to a writing school or did, creative writing or anything like this. But just the daily effort of wandering about in the village for a bit. Then you come back to, I was living in a chicken coop. So you come back to your chicken coop and then you by lamplight, you start taking notes. And actually, that's a very, very good training in writing, in observation, in writing, in forming sentences. And that was my equivalent of writing school. So it was very important to me, this this phase of my life. Anyway, so I finished my degree, and then after that I went back to India, and I immediately started working on a novel. That was my first novel. Then my second novel. And then after, it was almost 9 years after I had left the village, that, I was completely haunted by this experience. It was really by the experience of living in that village. And it was, in a very deep sense, a trauma. And I finally realized that I have to write about this. I have to write about that experience. But how do I do it? So I went back to the beginning, and I looked up that letter by this Jewish trader, and I decided the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to write a dual narrative of my life in this village in the present day, and of that Jewish trader's life in India, in the 12th century. And I thought this would be easy because surely all his letters are translated and so on. And I wrote a proposal and I sent it to Bill Buford of Granta magazine. And he really made it possible. He gave me an advance of £10,000, which seemed like a fortune back in those days. So I started working on it. And then suddenly I discovered that these letters hadn't been translated. And I went to Princeton where the letters are kept. So these letters are part of the Geniza documents, this vast collection of documents basically written in Judeo-Arabic, which is like medieval Ladino or something, except that it's Arabic, medieval colloquial Arabic written in the Hebrew script. So I went to Princeton where these letters were, and the guy who's like the gatekeeper of the letters, he said to me, these letters haven't been translated, and if you want to work on them, you have to do it yourself, the translations. So you can imagine how I felt at that moment. I mean, how am I going to learn, medieval colloquial Arabic written in the Hebrew script? But I had no choice at that point because I'd taken the money. So I sat down and started learning, the Hebrew script. And, the worst part is that in these letters, there's also lots of Aramaic, and you don't know when the Aramaic is Aramaic or when it's... Anyway, so I thought, well, I've got to give this a go. And I learnt the Hebrew script. Then I went off to Oxford, where the bulk of the Geniza documents were kept in those days. Actually, Cambridge, I'm sorry. It's the Taylor-Schechter collection in Cambridge. And I went there and I started working on them. And, it was very, very hard in the beginning. But I'm kind of a nerdy guy, I mean, I'm good at focusing on small things, So I started, deciphering. So back in those days, you could actually hold these documents in your hands. They would come to you in this thick binder and you could hold them. And it was such a transporting experience, to hold this very early variety of paper and feel its textures and see the movements of the pen on this, you could see where the pen had blotted a little bit. And, he's writing the actual letter on the recto. And then his recipient writes makes notes on the verso. So it's kind of an incredibly interesting puzzle. And then I discovered that really it's a problem basically of orthography, because basically what they're doing is they're substituting the Arabic letters with Hebrew letters. And actually, cursive Hebrew is much easier to read than cursive Arabic. So it was a gift in a way. And then suddenly one day it all came together. The thing is, Arabic is such a conservative language that they preserve a lot of the same idioms, a lot of the same usages. And I'd learned colloquial Arabic, the language spoken by peasants. So they were even more conservative. So anyway, I'm going on and on. So so I managed to translate these letters and I managed to write this book, which is called In an Antique Land. And that was the first thing I did, that was actually historical.
That's fascinating. And it leads me to wonder how you moved from this story in the Mediterranean basin into this Indian Ocean story. I see now kind of where the interest in history comes from, where the linguistic, fine-grained expertise comes into your beginnings as a writer. Can you tell us a little bit how we get to the Ibis trilogy displayed on this desk?
The story was not in the Mediterranean basin because, Abraham ben Yiju, who the merchant, he went basically from Cairo to Mangalore, in southern India, in the state of Karnataka. So it was basically him. They were just exchanging letters across the Arabian Sea. So that's where my interest in maritime trade and also in the maritime Indian Ocean history, that's where it began. One of the reasons why I took on Abraham ben Yeju's story is because I wanted to get a sense of what the pre-modern relationships were like, between Egypt and India, and then how that relationship becomes completely transformed by colonialism, etc.
And so how do we get to these books?
Yeah, so, okay. So I have always loved nautical fiction. I love Melville. Moby Dick is perhaps the most influential book in my reading life. And so I wanted to write, nautical fiction, And I had written about, in an earlier book, which was The Glass Palace, which is set in Burma, I'd written about Indian indentured workers, So then I wanted to write about, the maritime world of the Indian Ocean in the 19th century. So when I set off on that project, I thought it would mainly be about indenture, and that the maritime trade would be mainly centered on indenture. But very soon, when I started working on it, I discovered that no, that's not the case. Basically, the driving force of this of the 19th century maritime exchanges was opium. And it so happens that my father's family they were we are Bengalis from Bangladesh, but my ancestral village was destroyed by a flood in the 19th century. So my family started moving westwards towards Bihar, And they ultimately settled in this small town called, absolutely podunk town called Chhapra, and they lived there for about 100 years. And as a child, I used to wonder, why there? Why didn't they go to some nice place like Delhi or Bombay? And then, I slowly discovered that it's really because the entire economy of Bihar at this time is really based on opium. And that's what made it so interesting, because the indentured workers who went into the indenture in Mauritius and so on, they're all from this one particular region where they speak Bhojpuri, which is it's actually a language in its own right, but is now treated as a dialect. But so those were the people overwhelmingly who settled in Mauritius, Fiji, etc. And it so happened that I, grew up listening to this language because my father spoke Bhojpuri with his siblings. And I got into that story. And then the story veered off in another direction towards opium and so on. And that became the story in the end.
I'm glad you started mentioning stories, because I wanted to ask you a little bit about the connection between storytelling and history writing. Do you find that one limits the other in any way, or does one mostly, in your experience, help make sense of the other? I'm thinking especially of how you use the stories of a set of individuals in this sweeping trilogy to tell a story of massive historical change. And perhaps storytelling of this kind is the only way to bring together such a large area, a large time range. Maybe you could say a little more about that.
Look, I know that professional historians really look down on writers of historical fiction. I mean, that's there's always been that thing.
That wasn't behind my question.
No, I know. But in fact, the weird thing is that every professional historian comes into writing history because they've read historical fiction. I think that's almost universally the case. I started doing the research for this, and look, I think the way that a historian approaches history and the way that a novelist approaches history, they're very different. Those approaches have to be very, very different. Because let's just take, let's say the cotton trade, and if you're a historian writing about the cotton trade or the cotton economy or whatever, you work in long cycles of time. You can track fluctuations in prices, supply, demand, etc. But for a writer of historical fiction, the questions that you ask are completely different. They're much more akin to to the kind of research and the kinds of questions that military historians ask. And I'll explain to you in what sense, because if you're a writer of fiction, you have to set up scenes, because scenes are the basic way in which stories are told. Fiction is written. In order to write a scene, you have to know what the weather was like, what people were wearing, what they were eating, what the order of battle was. I mean, in my case, in Flood of Fire, I actually had to recreate the entire military history of the Opium War. Because no actual military history of the Opium War exists. Maybe today it does. Yes, there's one in Chinese which didn't exist at that time, but which hadn't been translated at that time, but which has been translated now. It's actually a very, very good, it's an excellent history. But I had to recreate all of that myself, go through all those endless collections in the British Library have you worked in the British? So the El Mill series, that is the military history series, and all of that. And it was a very long process of research, and it was very interesting because, again, when you look at the granular textures of those things, you suddenly discover that everything a novelist could want is actually in there. There are weather reports, there's all that stuff, but you have to be able to crunch it all together, into a single. At the end of the day, no one reads a novel for the history,
Except historians, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I have to say, an incredibly gratifying thing that happened after these books came out was that the American Historical Review, which is, after all, the flagship journal of your profession, they suddenly contacted me and said they wanted to do a forum on the trilogy. Yes.
So as we're getting into, one of the things that I think really distinguishes your work is the depth of research behind it. And I'm realizing now that this goes back to your first book, but it's certainly very evident in the Ibis trilogy. And so I wonder how you think that process fits in with or is a counterpart to the more imaginative, creative process that probably feels more natural to most writers or is more associated with the writing process. Does it all go back to your obsession with detail and your need to kind of ground the work in that detail, or how do you see those two processes fitting together?
The detail is actually very, very important because, in order to write a scene, I have to be able to visualize it. I simply can't sort of work in any other way when I'm writing fiction. Fortunately, as you know, for the China trade, there's an incredibly rich visual record. All these paintings, all the pottery, all the vast amount of art around it. So it was possible to sort of visualize these settings. But also, the great difficulty of writing historical fiction set in Asia, the huge difference between writing that and, say, writing historical fiction that's set in Tudor England or whatever. The great difference is that, if you're writing about Tudor England, everyone has a picture of it in their heads. They know what the food was like, they know what the clothes were like. Everyone carries some picture of that in their heads. But when you're writing about Asia, nobody has those pictures in their heads. Not even modern Asians have those pictures in their heads. For example, if you're writing about late 19th century Burma, can you try and visualize what people were wearing or what they were eating or how they behaved? It's impossible. So the problem there really is that you have to resist doing too much detail, because that's that becomes the kind of temptation. You have to find that balance between suggestion and description.
I want to turn now to your experiences in Macau. I think you mentioned yesterday that this is a place you've actually spent a lot of time, and I hadn't perhaps realized quite how many times you'd visited in the past. Although during the pandemic, I spent a certain amount of time in Guangzhou, and I came across a blog post you'd written about exploring the history of Guangzhou and tracking down some of the half-hidden remnants of that history. So I wonder if there are any places in Macau or the Pearl River Delta that you find particularly evocative of its history or that you recommend to audience members to visit.
Well, actually, one of the times I was in Macau, I was given a very exhaustive tour by your former colleague, Robert Anthony, who knows the place like the back of his hand. So he took me to all the sort of interesting nooks and crannies, showed me everything. Yeah, that was really wonderful. It was completely memorable. When I was here, of course, I looked up the Praia Grande because, so much of what I was writing about, happened over there. I tracked down Chinnery's house. Have any of you been to see it? His old house? Well, there's nothing left. It's just, but the number of the house remains the same. I mentioned it in that blog post. I mean, there's a horrible little block over there now. But so yeah, all of these things were. I spent time looking around here in the, in Casa Garden. I spent time in the cemetery. So all of that was very evocative.
And Macau shows up occasionally in some of these books, and Chinnery, buried about 100 meters that way, makes a guest appearance, a cameo. I think his son, or a fictional son, comes into one of the
fictional.
books. Oh, really? He's a real son?
Yeah, Chinnery actually had two bastard children with an Indian woman, a Bengali woman. We don't know very much about them. We do know that the older one was actually sent to England for something, I forget what now, and he died. Very little is known about the second son, so I invented it.
I see. So the son is real, but the story of his life is invented. So you mentioned a moment ago that opium became the center of the story you wanted to tell about the 19th century Indian Ocean world, stretching from the Western Indian Ocean all the way to Eastern Asia. And this is something you've returned to in Smoke and Ashes, the opium trade and its resonances today. Could you say a little bit about why you decided to return to that subject and why you think it matters today?
Well, after I finished writing these 3 books, I had a huge amount of material, a vast collection of materials of various kinds. And my wife actually said, you have to do something with all this material that you have. And I really didn't want to, because by that time I was so sick of opium, because it's a very grim and ugly thing, and living with that story day in, day out for 12 years, it was awful. So anyway, she persuaded me, and I put together a proposal. The proposal was accepted. They paid me advances in many places in the world, and I started writing it. And after about 6 months, I just gave up. I just couldn't bear it. So I returned the advances, which my friend Joe Stiglitz says you should never do. But I did, and I gave it all back. I said, contract's over, tore up the contract. And anyway, then I wrote several other books. I wrote The Great Derangement. I wrote The Nutmeg's Curse. And that somehow made me come back to the material, because I think the opium trade really foreshadows everything, everything in the history of our planetary crisis, the history of our environmental breakdown. And the last chapter in Smoke and Ashes is actually about the United States, because I think what we are seeing happening in the United States today is a bizarre sort of reversal of the Chinese opium crisis in the 19th century, And we see, just as opium undermined all the institutions of state, etc., in China, destroyed trust in the government, so that the governance of China, which was for centuries held up as a model to the whole world, suddenly this whole thing just begins to disintegrate. Corruption spreads everywhere. And I think we're seeing something very similar in America. I think one of the reasons why Trump has been elected and re-elected is simply because there was so much rage at the coastal elites when people were dying in their tens of hundreds of thousands, you know. More Americans died in a 5-year span of opioid overdoses than died in the Second World War. But nobody paid attention because these were just expendable people. And Purdue Pharma actually even uses that language, that these are expendable people. They use all the sorts of, all the sorts of excuses that British traders used in the 19th century, that this trade is driven by demand, not supply, which is something that obviously Adam Smith got entirely wrong, because when you're dealing with addictive substances, as the British understood very, very well, it's supply that drives demand, not the other way around. So we see that actually this thing is, there was so much rage in these, in poorer parts of America, in Appalachia and so on, and their suffering was completely ignored by coastal elites, you know. And I think, you know, whatever you may say about these gestures that Trump makes towards, bombing ships of Venezuela and talking about they won't have any impact on the trade, on the drug trafficking, but I think for those people, those poor people living in these red districts, even the performance has a value. You know, they suddenly feel that someone at least is paying attention to this, that they are not just trash.
You write in this book that opium has itself a kind of agency, or exists as a kind of historical force beyond the intentions of humans. I hope I'm getting that right, and I would be curious to hear you explain that point a little bit. When it comes to opium, and then whether you think that there are other objects that have that same kind of agency or historical force beyond human intentions.
Actually, it wasn't me. It was an American historian who first made this argument that opium has some sort of agentive force, and the way that we can read this is because opium creates these cycles of repetition. You know, I'm sure many of you have read Anat Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, where she really, I think, pretty comprehensively demonstrates that forests actually have some sort of agentive force which realizes itself in history. You know, so as soon as you begin to think about that, you begin to understand that there are many kinds of agentive forces within the universe that we see around us, and I think opium is actually one of those, and perhaps the clearest example.
So is opium actually the main character in these books?
In some sense, yes.
Does that lead you to want to write other books of that kind that take not humans necessarily, or not humans alone, but another commodity, an animal, a non-human being as the center of the work?
Oh yes, very much so. I would say that at this point in time, I think my feeling, the thing that I really want to do, is what writers have always done, going back to antiquity, which is to serve as ventriloquists for non-humans. You know, and as soon as you say non-humans cover an immense spectrum. You know, there's of course there are plants, animals, and especially botanical agency has become very interesting to me. But also there are so many other kinds of non-humans that coexist around us, if you like. So yeah, that's very much that's very much the direction of my work. And in fact, my newest novel, which isn't out here yet, but you can get it in Hong Kong, it's called Ghost Eye, and it explores some of those dimensions.
Well, that will lead to my final question for you before we turn to the audience for the Q&A, which is, What is interesting you these days when you travel, when you are reading, when you're lecturing? What has captured your interest and imagination?
So many things. I mean, I'm reading this fascinating book right now. I mean, I was reading it on the way here, then I lost my Kindle. uh, have any of you heard of the fourth man phenomenon? It's called the fourth man phenomenon and fourth man syndrome sometimes. So I'll give you just one example of it. Sir Ernest Shackleton, the great explorer, on his Antarctica. Oh my God! I think I must make space for that. For the agency of children who don't want to be listening to lectures. So Sir Ernest Shackleton. So once in Antarctica, his ship got stuck in ice, and they were running out of provisions and so on, and they had to leave the ship. Then they got stuck again, and finally Shackleton, with two other team members, they had to make this incredible journey, partly by boat, in the terrible seas around Cape Horn, and then across an island, on the other side of which was a whaling station. But to get to the whaling station, he had to cross this mountain range. So he and these two other men, they set off on this astonishingly brutal journey, with bitter cold, winds, storms, etc. And they went on and on and on, and finally they made it. But all through this climb, Shackleton had the sense that they were not three but four, that there was another person climbing with them, whose face he never saw, knew nothing about him, but he sensed his presence, with his team. And he didn't mention it to the others, to the other two, because he thought that they would think he was mad. But once they actually reached the whaling station, they all spontaneously said, "Did you feel that fourth person who was with us?" And of course there was no fourth person, or maybe there was. What do we know? But this is a story that repeats itself very often. Mountaineers have often felt the presence of another person there. And in many, many other circumstances of danger, in wartime situations and so on. So it's a very fascinating thing, actually. I mean, how this comes about and how people can sense these other presences. And it's interesting because this book on the fourth man, the fourth man is, T.S. Eliot read Shackleton's memoir of this journey, and he actually mentions it in one of his poems, The Fourth Man, which is how the name for this syndrome comes about. But it's a remarkable sort of compilation of all the people who've experienced this syndrome.
So perhaps we can look forward in the coming years to a book on this topic, and maybe the fourth man turns out to be the wind or some other non-human agentive force, but in any case, I'm sure it will be great. So I'm going to ask now for any questions for Amitav.
Okay, I'm actually very glad you mentioned you read V.S. Naipaul. And I was wondering if, in any ways, that V.S. Naipaul's historic fiction writing, also his career trajectory, have influenced you in any way. You also, with all your many literary productions that you are finding your way in the world, or in the future, are we expecting you writing something like more of a nonfiction, for example, memoir and such? Thank you.
Naipaul's work was very, very important to me in my college years and so on. I still love his early work. The House for Mr. Biswas, for example, and Mimic Men, and those early books. I loved those books. And I loved also his some of his nonfiction, his travelogues. I found them very, very interesting. But the trouble with Naipaul's nonfiction is that he writes with such certainty, and he's almost always wrong. Completely wrong. Do any of you remember his book, The Overcrowded Barracoon, which was about Mauritius? And after I visited Mauritius to do research, I met the people who Naipaul had met. And actually, Naipaul himself was a child of the indenture. And these were all children of the indenture, so to speak. So after Mauritius became independent, they wanted a sympathetic voice to tell their story. So they got together what little money they had and they invited Naipaul. Little knowing that inviting Naipaul into your house is like inviting a cobra into your house. So Naipaul went back and he wrote this absolutely venomous tract about the overcrowded barracoon, where he essentially makes this neo-Malthusian argument that this place is overcrowded, it's going to collapse, everything will be destroyed, it's awful. In fact, Mauritius became a really prosperous place, and today it's actually the richest country in Africa. And it's a wonderful place, where people have somehow created a strange little, wonderful little paradise. So he was just completely wrong about that. And wrong about so many other things as well. But the novels, some of the novels are really wonderful, the early novels especially. I knew him, I met him, and I can tell you, he was, the things he said, I can't even repeat them.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to hear you again.
Thank you.
Actually, I had two very different questions, if I may. The first one is a curiosity. When I was a kid, I learned that Dom Pedro I was a trader because he gave the independence to Brazil. I was studying in Portugal. Then I went to Brazil and I learned he was a hero. So I was a very young kid when I understood this, how relative facts can be interpreted according to cultural perceptions. How do you deal with that in your research? Being an Indian writer, how do you look at these facts and how you deal with these relative cultural perspectives? In the end, are we still stuck to it? As an Indian writer, do you think we are all biased when you look
all what?
We are still all biased when we look at the facts, right? We look at, in a certain perspective, how we deal with that in your historic fiction books. The second question is more a provocation. Yesterday you said that the Opium War was an extractivist act of capitalism, as so many others. Looking at the world today, are we still stick to the same story?
Mm-hmm. Well, the second question is very easily answered, yes. We are absolutely living through that. In so many ways, as I said yesterday, the story begins, with the spices, which were the opium of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And what happened to the Banda Islands? 1621, the Banda Islands is the only place in the world that has the nutmeg tree. The Dutch are trying to gain control of the nutmeg trade. So in 1621, they go there and they essentially exterminate the entire population of the Banda Islands. So, just think of what this means. The Banda Islanders had this miraculous tree of life. And suddenly one day it becomes their tree of death, And that's what's happened again and again with the resource curse. Look at what's happening around the Gulf today. It's entirely, what's behind it. It really is the resource curse. And everywhere you see, fossil fuels, oil, etc. That's the story. The first question was?
The relative way we can look at facts.
Yeah.
When you do your research.
Sure. So one of the main characters in these books, and I think he's actually one of the most sympathetic characters, is a Parsi opium trader, And I became very invested in this guy's life and how he would think, how he would see the world. And it was very instructive. Essentially, once this trade was set up, if you were from an Indian mercantile community, you basically had no choice. There was no other source of capital at that time. And so the Parsis were one of the white adjacent groups that the British allowed into the trade. The Parsis, the Nyonyas of Singapore, and so on. So they were fortunate. They made money from this. And then they set up, some of the world's leading industries. I mean, for example, during COVID, it turned out that it was a Parsi family that was producing all the vaccines, for example. Go figure.
Have you been to the Parsi cemetery in Macau?
I have not only been there, I bet I've been to a place that you've never probably seen, which is the Parsi cemetery of Guangzhou.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it's very difficult to get to. Tan Sen Sen, who you probably know, he got us permission to go.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
If I could ask to someone who has obviously researched so much on the colonialist experience in India, and not only in India, but in Asia, throughout Asia. If I could ask maybe what is your perception of the Portuguese presence in India, or if you have ever come any episodes that you think are interesting and would like to share about the Portuguese presence in India.
Well, I spent a long time living in Goa, so I've seen it through that perspective as well. The Portuguese legacy is very divided in some way. I mean, the Portuguese were religious fanatics. But once you converted, you were completely equal. So it was really remarkable. I mean, so many viceroys of Macau were in fact, Goans. And it's very interesting to read accounts of that, but when the British would come to Macau and see that there was a black man, a Goan, actually running the place, they were completely horrified. They would say, how do they allow this? It's impossible, because for them, race was their whole thinking, and it continues in some way even today, was fundamentally based on race, And similarly, Richard Burton, when he went, the explorer Richard Burton, when he went to Goa, have you ever read his account of Goa? It's just this stuff. Oh, these Portuguese, they're so degenerate. They keep marrying black people and they keep having children with black people. What's the matter with them? They're so, So, it's a very interesting thing. There's that sort of, it was, I think, the only European empire that wasn't completely founded upon, racial difference.
Hello, Mr. Ghosh. So, first, we hope that you can give back to your Kindle. And
My what?
Your Kindle.
Okay.
We really hope you can give back your Kindle, because if I lose mine, my heart will be broken. Because that leads to my kind of question. So I'm really curious about, nowadays we're living in a digital age. And me, myself, I am a keen user of this kind of e-reader. But I'm curious to know, what's your perception about how this different reading form will kind of give us a different perspective of reading. Does it kind of reduce the density of reading, or because reading is as essential as writing for a writer, but if we are reading on a different this sort of stance, so I'm very curious about, is there any different, of course there are differences between this and the paperbacks, but is there anything that's maybe help you or kind of that you're, I don't know how to put it, because myself, I read in these two ways, like interchangeably, and I found sometimes reading in digital form can be very helpful, and you can look up for certain words like very efficiently. But also, like I said, it kind of lacks of a density when you're holding this device. So I really want to know about your opinion about that. Thank you.
I have to say I don't particularly like reading on Kindle, but really, it's so convenient, especially if you're flying or whatever. I don't know how younger people of your age read. I don't know what their reading habits are. I don't know how they read. I do think that I'm of the last generation of writers who will have an audience of readers who are trained to read big books like this. I think those habits of reading are going to disappear. I can see that with my own children. Fortunately, my audience will last at least my lifetime, I hope. but with the next generation, I just don't know. Whether they'll be able to go through the labor of reading, or whether it'll interest them, to read very long, extended narratives. I just don't know. I feel fortunate in that I came of age in a reading culture that was very focused, where we were taught very rigorous ways of reading. I don't teach, so I don't know, but what I hear from my friends who are academics is that those skills are absolutely gone now. That many younger readers simply cannot read. In the last couple of years, the levels of illiteracy amongst younger people in the United States has gone from 18% to 25%. It's really one of the most shocking statistics that you can imagine. So I really don't know what the future will be for reading and writing.
We're just about running out of time. Maybe there's time for one more quick question.
Just a very minor question. Talking about the size of the book and Hernan Diaz's earlier talk. Did you set out to write a trilogy, or did the book just grow and grow? Did you have a blueprint, or did it just... You said you had so much material you had to then write a later book. So was it always imagined as a trilogy, or was it simply too much material?
I'm like a nun. I don't have those little post-its or, plot lines. I don't have any. I do have notebooks in which I make extensive notes, but I don't have it all planned in my head. For me, writing is a process of discovery, of learning and discovery. I mean, I like to, find out about things, and at the same time, you discover things about your characters. You discover where your plot is going,
Did your publishers know that there would be 3 books?
So, 1.5 years into writing Sea of Poppies, I knew it would be a trilogy, because, I just knew it was too big a story to tell in a single book.
Please, everybody, join me in thanking Amitav for this great talk.
And thank you, Joshua.